Hello, friends. Welcome. It is our second lecture of week one. So really fun stuff. We have got a lot going on. Sorry about that. We've got a lot going on for this class. So I'm really excited and we'll jump in and get started so that way we can utilize our time as optimal as possible. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You have 2 discussion questions due by Sunday, 11:59 PST or PDT, whichever one we're on. I can't remember. So please make sure you guys are doing that. That is the biggest issue at the end. I always get students that say week 7 and 8, hey, is there any way I can make up discussion questions? Guys, there's no way you can make up discussion questions. That is not a me thing. I wish you could. If I had the ability, I would let you do it. My hands are tied there. So please make sure that you guys are doing that and you are doing those discussion questions, because there's nothing I can do. If you get to the end and you pass your exam and you do all of your assignments, but you have missed 5 total discussion questions, you're going to have to retake no matter what. So please make sure you're doing them. It's a terrible thing. There's 8 weeks. You have to do them for each 8 weeks. So especially don't start off week 1 not doing them, because it puts yourself in a little bit of a hole. Cool. You've got 3 core assignments. Predict destructuring. We talked about destructuring yesterday. Convert to arrow. We are talking about arrow function. I had a lot of questions about that in class. We're actually talking, in office hour. We're actually talking about that today in class. So we should be good to go there. And then tomorrow, we were going to talk about props. We're going to talk about components. We're going to talk about props and everything, sort of that you need for these first assignments. In office hour, we had a whirlwind of information. I probably give you guys too much, so I'm really sorry, but it is recorded. So if you guys ever, if you felt yourself stressed, trying to keep up, don't worry about it. It's always going to be recorded, especially if I'm showing something like this. So you can always go back and do that with you, or do that kind of and follow along. Now, one thing we acknowledged was I'm on a Mac computer. So a lot of my terminal stuff does not translate. And so I believe Tabitha posted something in our Discord that is just a cheat sheet from Columbia, I think, which we love that. They're super smart there. So a cheat sheet for that if you're on Windows. And I think somebody else also posted a cheat sheet. So thank you guys for doing that. I will work on seeing if I'll look at it, and if there's anything that I feel like it's missing, I'll add that in. And if it covers it, then you guys will be good to go there for the Windows. Cool. Just a recap of what we did yesterday. We had an intro to the class, right? We talked about like all the different tools we have. We talked about all of the different things. And then we talked about what is a full stack application, right? We had a visualization of how, from a very, very basic level, how a full stack application works, the request response cycle, where we go make a request, our server decides, or our backend decides, well, what are we going to do with it? Do I have the information to give it back? Do I have to go get it from the database, bring it back, and then do something? So we talked a little bit about that, and had a high level walkthrough. So that way we have an understanding of exactly what we're doing, and what we're building in this class specifically. We also talked about destructuring. So instead of having to use like rest or spread or use our index position, we talked that we can actually destructure and take values within a array or within a object, and we can destructure them and then call them somewhere else. If we wanted to say name, if we wanted to say age within an object, we're able to grab those. We even talked about at the end, I can't remember who it was, but somebody, maybe a Spencer, put how we can also rename our destructuring. So if you guys are kind of stuck on that, or if you haven't started that assignment, we talked about that at the end of class. So you could always go watch the recording and follow through there as well. Just as a reminder, recordings are here as well. So we've got recording right there. We've got our lecture videos here. And then we also have them here. Let me go back here. One thing I want to note is today there was a new sort of thing introduced. Is this got cleaned up a little bit. So this is only the current stacks that are going. So we've got this cadence started 4 weeks ago. I guess they're on week 5 now. And then obviously we just started. So these 2 are here, but if you're ever looking at this or you're wanting more, you can navigate to the bottom where it says bonus lectures, archive playlists. And then here are all the playlists of the information. Now we're working on finding or kind of distinguishing between the 2, but please be aware that some of this code we have changed. So these Some of these older ones used to use a tool called Reach Router that we don't use anymore. We use React Router DOM. And so just different tools like that. So we're trying to work on a way to indicate, hey, this is old, sort of deprecated information. A lot of it's the same, but there might be some things like Reach Router that are not the same anymore. So if you guys are looking for those playlists, you can find them here in this lectures, bonus lectures, and then archive playlists. Cool. Any questions on what we talked about yesterday, on the class, on anything before we get started with actual class? Cool. That's a great question, Spencer. I'm not sure. I think it has React portions in there. So let's see. So Spencer asked, what is this built with? Yeah, it's built with React. React, I don't know what our backend is though. Cool. Okay. So here's what we have today. Here's a little glimpse of what we're doing. We have our JavaScript basics. We're going to talk about ES5 versus ES6 from a high level. The platform goes through it and talks about sort of ES5. Too far. Talks about that. ES5 and ECMAScript and what that means. We're going to talk about this in depth to an extent. We're going to talk about really the two things that we're going to talk about are var, let, and const, how we can have those and what the differences between all of those are. And then we're going to talk about arrow functions versus function declarations. And I know that you guys have an assignment that is converting to an arrow function. We're going to show you how to do that. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that make arrow functions kind of preferable, especially when we're dealing with React as well. Then after that, we're going to walk through what is why React, right? Like I said, that this was a really, really popular front-end language. Why is it? And it also is what we call a single page application. We're going to look at what does that mean? What is a single page application or an SPA? You might hear it as. Now, I'm going to give you guys a warning when we're talking about Git and we're handling Git. There's a biggest problem I see with students is nested Git repositories. So I'm going to give you guys a warning on that. We're going to create our first React project. And with whatever time we have left, we're going to do an in-depth look at the different files that are created for us. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is we're going to create our first component. So we're really going to dive in, create our first component, see how that works and how we can bring that in and what we can do. We'll look at the structure of a component. We'll understand what does a component need. And then secondly, we're going to introduce props and show you guys sort of what props can do and what we can do with props. You can sort of think of props if you guys are already working ahead as just a parameter or an argument being passed in to a function, right? And then being able to use it. So it's kind of from a high level, really what it is. There's one little thing we got to do with it, but other than that, that's just kind of all it is. It's just a parameter that's being passed through into a function. But that's what we're going to go. And that's what our next class will be as well, components and props. And then we'll probably not have enough time, but we'll talk about JSX and Babel tomorrow as well. So I think we'll finish off the React portion tomorrow. Or finish off looking in depth at sort of the files that we really need. And then we'll do components and props because that probably won't take up the entire class. Cool. Great. So let's jump in. Obviously this is going to be a lot of code that I've already pre-written. I will push this to GitHub. I will put the GitHub link there. I didn't push yesterday because it didn't necessarily seem like there was a lot of new information, but the GitHub code will have yesterday's as well. So it'll have both. So my apologies on that if you were looking for it. But if you guys are trying to follow along with it, I will, don't worry, I will pass that through. Before I jump in, are there any questions on anything from a recap, from a housekeeping, any quick questions that we can do that before I just jump into the code? I see some people are asking just in DMs to talk about destructuring a little bit. I can do that. If we have time at the end of class, I can talk about destructuring. And if not, then I'm happy to talk about that in office hour tomorrow. Destructuring is really going to come when we are dealing with, when we're just looking at different information and we're wanting to show that with a component. So cool. Okay. Let's jump in to the code. It's going to be a fun one, guys. We're starting already. Like other stacks you guys kind of build in, and we just head first go straight for React. So kind of fun, but kind of overwhelming. And I hear that if you're feeling overwhelmed, that's okay. And we will get there. And I promise you, it'll become more familiar. Cool. So you've been hearing this word ES5 and ES6, and you're like, what on earth does that mean? Well, ES really just stands for ECMAScript. And that is just the background of JavaScript, right? And how this is working and sort of the format of what JavaScript, how it operates and how it works, right? And so ECMAScript is really the de facto kind of layer and rule setting of how JavaScript works, right? Because it really stands for the European Computer Manufacturers Association, right? And so they have standardized JavaScript and said, this is how it needs to work, right? And here's the different things that we need it to do. And we need it to kind of, in order to stay relevant, we needed to do certain things. And that's where ES5 to ES6 happens. ES5 sort of represents JavaScript back in the day and how it was first built. It was built in like, I think 6 days because they really just needed something quickly. It was called something else and they named it JavaScript because they wanted the association between Java and JavaScript, right? Even though they have nothing to do with each other. And so with something that's built in 5 days, you could see that there was, or you could sort of imagine that there's quite a few issues, and there's really funny videos and lots of memes about like sort of the weird things and weird nuancy things with how JavaScript works. But the ECMA standard is trying to make it more of a language that follows other rules and is similar to other languages, so that way it can continue to be utilized and popular. And so once that was standardized, and the original one was called ECMAScript 5, they came out with ECMAScript 6. And what ECMAScript 6 does is it sort of eliminates a lot of the issues or the pain points that we're going to talk about today for JavaScript and using JavaScript and developers developing in JavaScript, right? If you have this antiquated language and it won't get better, people are eventually going to move to something that solves that problem, right? And so they are continuously trying to bring out more and more things and increasing JavaScript, increasing speeds and increasing different tools and utilizing different build types or different kind of styles about how people build, so that way JavaScript continues to stay king. Now, from a high level, any browser that you're using is really just using JavaScript, right? Like JavaScript is king of the front end. That is a fact. Everything basically interprets JavaScript, even HTML really is JavaScript that is then interpreted as HTML, but JavaScript is really king on the front end. And so because of that, they had to add in and create some new additions to that. And the biggest one, or there's two that we're really going to focus on. The biggest one would be changing variables. Instead of it being var, they introduced these new types of variable declaration called let and const. And so we're going to look at this here in a second. So here for var, if I wanted to, this is within ECMAScript 5, right? If I wanted to declare var a equals 1, I was able to do that. Then I could say var a equals 2. And if I console logged it, I rewrote or redeclared a as a new value. And this became a real big issue because maybe if you had this super large code base and you didn't know that a certain variable name was being used and you redeclared it like this, right? var a, then what would end up happening is you redefine the value. And so it could mess up different portions. And that became a real big pain point for developers, right? Because they didn't know, within this entire code base, is this variable already declared? And you can think about back in the day before they had like Command F and being able to find and say like, hey, where's all the variables that start with A? They didn't have that, right? So they had to look through the code, and it just was a real big pain point. Enters in let and const. And so what these do is these are variable declarations. They have some differences, but what is real important is you can't redeclare a variable if you start it with let or you start it with const. And so here if you were to try to do this, you would get a syntax error that says identifier B has already been declared. So let's say that this variable is just called B. I can't say let B equals 2. Now I could, because this is let, just say B equals 2. But with const, I cannot. Can anybody tell me why? Why is this not going to work? Anybody know?
It's immutable.
Constant.
Immutable.
Yeah, exactly. What let is what we call mutable, mutable, meaning that after I declare it, I can change its value, right? Here, B equals 1. Now I'm redeclaring, I'm mutating, I guess maybe that's what mutable is, changing the value and saying, okay, B now equals 2. And it says, okay, cool. Yeah, you're allowed to do that. So if I were to do this, I get 2, right? Const, and sort of the power between const is once you declare it within this scope, and we'll talk about scope here in a second, you cannot change that value. So here I'm going to get an error because it's going to say, hey, assignment to a constant variable. You cannot, once this has been declared and it's given a value, you cannot change it. That is really powerful and something that I think like Python, for example, is really lacking, right? Because there is no const in Python. There is none of that stuff. But the difference between let and const is both of them can only be declared once, but let is mutable while const is immutable. I think I spelled that correctly. Meaning that I can't redeclare it and I can't change it after it's been declared. So that will give me an error, but this in itself will obviously work because I've declared it once and now I can do that. Cool. Now, when it comes to these guys, really the big thing is going to be dealing with scope, right? And identifying scope and how variables work with scope. Scope is really just an understanding of what do you have available to you, right? What do you have access to within variables, within functions, within for loops, right? And so here, let's just kind of look for a second at identifying scope. Here we've got a whole bunch of different things. We have a variable. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. There you go. We have a variable called beetles, which is an array of 4 names. This is our global scope, right? Meaning that wherever we want to call beetles, we can, right? Then we have a function, and then all of this stuff is within our function scope. Then we have another function. And so then certain values are available within different scopes, right? Or outside of certain scopes, which we'll see here in just a second. So if I'm looking at var, this is within a for loop, right? If I have this value, I have a for loop, var I, right? Within my for loop, I have this set timeout, I console log it. And then on the outside of my for loop, I want to console log I still have access to this value because it's var, right? Var allows me to have access, which can get kind of confusing, right? I is really just meant for this code right here, right? We don't need it. We don't need to have access to it. But if I were to run this, I still get access to 3, right? Which is not what we want. I also don't know why this is 3333. It's interesting. Try that again. Interesting. Not the point of right now. Okay. Now, what's nice though, is with let, what it allows you to do is whenever we've got a variable and we declare it with let, it is based on that scope itself, right? So here, if I have this for loop, right, and I declare let of I have access to it within this scope. Within this curly bracket, that's usually how we signify scope within JavaScript, right? I have access to it, but outside of this for loop, I can't console log. If I were to console log I, it's going to say I is not defined because I only lives within this for loop. I only lives within this for loop. Cool. Now const, any ideas on what's going to happen if we were to say console log? Oh, I guess I gave it away. But const is the same way, right? It doesn't allow for that global scope like var, right? Once this is declared, var is sort of available globally, if you will. It doesn't allow for that, right? I'm set and saying, cool, const I is this guy, right? It's within this scope, and that's the only place it's available. So it gives us a lot more flexibility in regards of, again, if I have I in another place, I'm not redefining, I'm not changing that value. It is just for, and we're able to create variables just for that section or just for that piece of code and what we want it to do. And we don't have to worry about it affecting all of our code outside of, we don't have to worry about it affecting our code throughout our entire code base, which is huge. Cool. Same sort of thing, right? This is the difference between var, let, and const within a function. So here, if I'm looking at this function, cool, I have access here. If I console log I, a is not defined. Var on this one within this function scope is not available, right? And then with this one, but this I will say within a function, var operates in the same way as a let and a const, meaning that it'll give you not defined if you call it outside of that function scope. So that's where some of the differences come. Again, we can redeclare a value within my function, var a equals 1, var a equals 2. But similar to how we had earlier talked about, right? We can't redeclare with it for const, and we can't redeclare with let, but similar to above, we can't access it either, right? Outside of this function, I or B is not defined and C is not defined. So it's similar to sort of how that's just sort of how they are working through this. Now, if we just have a normal block scope, then that's where A becomes global, right? And I have access to this, just not within a function. B would not allow that, right? Or sorry, let does not allow that. I'm trying to do this. It's available within this block, but it is not globally defined like it is with var. var also handles something called hoisting. And that's where some of the issue comes in, is like once it's declared, it'll automatically hoist. You don't have to worry about hoisting. It's not necessary for what you're doing right now. It's a little bit more in depth. But if you want to look at the difference between var and let, really look at hoisting. People had sort of said, and I would agree, that var let sort of replaces var because var is mutable, right? You can still use it. var is still used, and that's why we show this and why I wanted to show it, because there are still some companies that use var, right? Though I don't maybe agree, or maybe it's not the best, they just are sort of antiquated, and that's what we talked about yesterday. So I try to show you as much as I can for that. But those are really the main differences, is that let allows you, does not allow you to redeclare. So that is huge. And it keeps, so if you're taking away anything, let and const do not allow you to redeclare a value. And it couples your variable just to the scope that is necessary. It doesn't give you any sort of global scopes. You're not overdoing or taking, you're not redefining any sort of values there. Same thing with a conditional statement. If you have an if statement, right? Again, var is more global, so you still have access outside of your if statement. Let and const are coupled just within that, so it is just reusable. But you don't have to like worry about it. Just creates a little bit more flexibility because you're not worried about affecting your entire code base. Somebody asked, what is an example of why we would redefine var within the same scope? you would always get the second. Yeah, that's a good point. It's just sort of to show you that I can redefine, whereas the other ones I cannot do that because you get a syntax error. So it's a great point. Yeah, you wouldn't. I mean, that doesn't make any sort of logical sense, right? Because you're just redefining. But it was just more of a point to show the difference between the two is, hey, I can redefine var. Let, I cannot do that. I can change let. I just can't. Like this works, right? I've already declared it once, and then I can redefine it. Const, I cannot, right? I can just declare it and that's it. Cool. Any questions on these? On sort of let var const? Var let const, I guess would be the correct order. Let me look at chat. Sorry, guys, I'm also rocking no TAs today. So if I'm missing something in the chat, I'm super sorry. Somebody said var and arrow functions. So arrow functions are ES6. So yeah, that would probably be why arrow functions were introduced when var and let were also introduced. So if that's kind of what you're referring to, then that makes sense. Because yeah. So that is local scope or var is not. Yes, that is correct. Cool. I think I hit everything. If I didn't hit everything, then feel free to private message me and then I can make sure that I do that. Cool. Can you just put a 1 in the chat if this is making sense? Put a 0 if it is not. Perfect. Somewhere in between also works. Love the 11s. Cool. Great. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is our different types of functions. Now, you guys have an assignment that is dealing with arrow functions, right? First off, here's an arrow function. We talked a little bit about this in office hours. So if you're wondering what's the difference between these two, I'll talk about it a little bit, but we also talked about it in office hour at the very beginning. So you can go watch the office hour and we'll talk. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more in depth of that. So one more quick thing. Lines 28 and 30 don't make sense. So somebody said there's so much outside of the curly brackets. So one thing to note is this is the scope, right? So it's not just these guys. It's this is the real scope because that's what we're declaring our for loop. And so the only thing technically outside of this scope that is declared is this console log. This is still within these two curly brackets here. So that's the scope.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
There's somebody that Tabitha may have a question.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
Oh, my bad.
Nope, you're good. No, thank you for looking out. I appreciate it. I don't have a TA right now.
Yeah,
So this is just a function, a timeout function that holds some time where you console log and then you have 0. This is just a function.
So is 0 the time frame for the timeout?
Yeah.
Okay, I just am not used to things being outside of a curly bracket. Everything is typically inside, correct? So that threw me off a lot, and I wasn't sure if it just got moved down or.
Yeah. So the function is within this, but then because it's set timeout, this curly bracket matches this curly bracket, and so it's just part of the function call. So you can actually, this is what we call a callback function, and so it's actually taken as you can really just think of this as the first argument.
Okay.
And then this is the second, like a second parameter. So
All right,
set timeout takes in one thing and then comma the time. So that's what this is. I guess it'd be, I mean, you can think about it like this. Like that, where this is the first argument, comma, this is second. We'll talk about callback functions and higher order functions, I think next week.
Okay.
That
when you like moved it all into a singular line, I guess it makes a bit more sense.
Yeah.
I thought it was closing for the for loop at first, and then I was like, it's probably closing for the set timeout. But even if it is, what exactly does the 0? Yeah, I don't want to waste your time, but yeah, that's
no, you're fine. Yeah, exactly.
So hard.
This is just our function that has a parenthesis, and then here's just sort of the arguments being passed in, or the parameters, right? So here's parameter 1, comma, here's parameter 2. It's called a higher order function, but we'll talk about that. In the not necessary right now, just knowing that Cool. I is still available outside of that with var, and it's not for let, or it's the big takeaway there. Because it's tied in only within this. Great questions though. Cool. Speaking of arrow functions, let's go ahead and talk about those. So again, there's been some questions. Here's what you have. Your assignment is just converting, right? So you're going to convert to an arrow function. What you're going to have is certain things that you can do, or certain sort of methods in this, what we call anonymous function or function expression. And we're going to convert that into a arrow function. So what does that mean? So back in the day with good old ECMAScript 5, we just had function declaration, and we still can use this. I just want to point out, you can still use these guys. It's not like you just can't use a function, and we still will use functions. Don't get me wrong. But with ECMAScript 6, we were able to start looking at a few different things, right? So what we saw is, first off, here's our normal function within JavaScript, right? Where this is our function declaration. So it's our keyword of function. I can never spell it right, but I did this time. So we have function, and then we're calling it foo, right? Foo bar is like a normal thing if you're just kind of thinking through it. And all this function does is it console logs the word foo, right? So we're declaring our function. Here's our function name. It does not take in any parameters or arguments. And then all it does is it console logs this string, and that's it. Now, as a reminder, anytime we have a function, it's a piece of code that we have that maybe we want to reuse, especially if we're going to continuously reuse it. That's always a great thing. If you're doing the same thing over and over, it's always a great idea to put that in a function so we can have dry code. But in order for that code to be ran, we have to do what we call a function call. So we call that name here with this parenthesis. And if we had any sort of arguments or parameters we had to pass in, then we would do that. We don't. But whenever we call this, what it will do is it will go and it will run this function. All this function does is call foo. And so if I run this, we should just get foo. Perfect. That is our function declaration. Now, the second thing you saw is what we call a function expression. Now, this is where, when I say second thing, I mean it here in this arrow functions. This is going to be our top part. This is what we call a function expression, or sometimes known as an anonymous function, where we are creating this variable of foo, right? And let's just say let. Let's try it. Yeah. So we have this variable of foo, and it is a anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. So it is a function. It's a functional expression. And then we are console logging foo. So it's doing the same thing, but I guess in this case, I'm going to do this. But instead of having to declare this function, and there's some things under the hood that change there, but instead of having to declare this function, we can just create what we call a functional expression. And that's just easier way sort of to declare this function and to use this function. It's a little bit quicker. And it sort of leads us into, from a functional expression, we won't use these a ton, leads us into what we call an arrow function. So again, we have our functional expression here where we have this var foo equals function, and then it doesn't take in anything. We have our curly brackets here, and then we can console log foo. Great. Entering our arrow function, or sometimes called a fat arrow function. And what this does is it looks very similar, but it's a little bit quicker to write. And it operates a little bit differently. Where here, if I've got var foo and I don't have any sort of parameters, I don't have to put the word function. Instead, I have this arrow right here. What that arrow does is it tells JavaScript, hey, I'm using an arrow function. And so under the hood, JavaScript has all of these different functions, and the different types of functions have different properties, right? Different things and different ways that it handles code. That's way too in depth for what we're talking about, but just know that under the hood, there's a lot of things going on with the arrow function that gives us a little bit of flexibility when it comes to React. It also makes it operate very simply, to where if I've got a arrow function, I can do something like this, and that works great. But also, if I want to return, or let's say that I had, let's go actually to the platform here. It's a great idea. Let's just take this code. Oh, I did that on the bottom. We'll see how an arrow function can even be more easily written. Is, let's say we had this, say hello. And we talked about this guy, remember, yesterday, and we talked about it in office hour as well. But this function of say hello, all it does is it takes in a name, right? It takes in one value. Here's my argument. And then all I'm doing is I'm console logging hello world or hello name. And in case we say world, then it does that. Somebody asked this in the chat, and that's a great point. What's nice about it is if we just have one parameter that we're passing in, you actually don't need the curly brackets. It's implied. So I just say this, but then also, or parentheses, sorry, is if I just have one statement, I also don't need these other curly brackets to define this. So I can just say something like this. Cool. So now this function operates the same way, but it's not a lot less code, but it's less code, right? I don't have to have the parenthesis. I don't have to have certain things. I can just implicitly return, or implicitly, if I just have this one thing that it's doing, console log, then I'm able to do that. Now, if I was going to do multiple things, like if I wanted it to console log and then return 1 + 1, then I would need the curly bracket, or then I do need curly brackets like this. And then if I had something like, so there's two things we could do. We could do return 1 + 1, or like hello world. Hello world. We could do it like this. Or if I had some sort of value and I didn't want to do the return, I could also put this as a parenthesis as well. And that implicitly returns, so I don't need the return. Also don't need this. Okay. No, that's not correct. We'll just do this guy. Perfect. So if I had multiple values, then what I can do is I can just put my curly bracket, and then I can have a bunch of information, right? If I want to do multiple console logs, if I want to do multiple things, I could do that. And at the end, I just pass in a return. Now, I know that there's a way that you can do it with a parenthesis around it that automatically sort of implicitly returns. Off the top of my head, I don't have the syntax right now, but I can look at that. We'll use that in class as we get a little bit closer to like promises. But cool. Now, if I wanted to do an arrow function that had multiple things, right? Multiple parameters that it's passing in, then I do have to have the parenthesis around it. And then I just separate them by a comma. Now this is having a default value of age of 18. We talked about this in office hour. And so that way, if another value wasn't being passed in, this will default to 18. But if I pass in the number 25, it'll get rid of the 18 and make it equal to whatever 25 is. Regardless, if I've got a arrow function, a functional expression, or a normal function, I still have to have my function call. So that's what this say hello is doing, is it's just my function call. It's calling my function, passing in the information, and then it's doing some sort of information there. Cool. Any questions on arrow functions? Arrow functions work in HTML script tags as well. Yeah, well, just whenever you have a script tag, it's just JavaScript. So yeah, script is just saying I'm going to do some JavaScript, and this is JavaScript. So yeah, works just fine.
If you have like a short function that you want to do on click on an HTML element, can you write it inline inside of the on click value? Awesome.
Yeah, so you'll have an event. We're going to do that a lot. You'll have an event that you have to pass through. And then, yep, we'll do that a lot. So that you can just, and that's again, the power of arrow functions is you can just build that right in there.
Sweet.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Do you mind if I ask a question about the homework? I was just wondering, like on the homework, it says like document dot get element by ID, and then it has the parameter. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Yeah, keep going. So the first one where it says function get value from ID and then the parameter ID dot value or curly bracket. So a little further down. I wish it had the numbers on it, but it says function get value from ID. So it's like the third one up.
Oh,
Yeah,
this guy.
right there.
Yeah.
Would you need to replace function in that one? I tried putting a fat arrow there, but it didn't work anymore.
Yeah. So it should just, you would have to create your variable, right? So you would say, let get value from ID equals, and then let's talk about that after class, but yeah. So
Okay,
we'll just have to
sorry.
create that.
Okay.
And then you get rid of function, add let, and then we can absolutely do that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Sorry. Just
Yeah.
got a little bit to go through, but yeah, let's after class. I'm happy to stay and kind of help you with that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other quick questions on this? Looking at the chat. Cool. All I've got now is, yeah. So if you are writing more than one line, so there's a question, if I write more than one line, do I have to write curly brackets? You do. Yeah. With arrow functions, you do. Okay. So what I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about these two, and then maybe tomorrow, and then maybe we'll create a React app. And then tomorrow we'll do our in-depth look at the different files. Cool. So I'm going to create a react.txt, and we're going to talk about single page applications. I know that you guys love visuals, so we're going to do that. So right now, currently what is happening for what you guys maybe know of is we've got some sort of page here, right? And maybe we're going to call this our index.html. So we're going to say index.html, right? And if you guys are coming from any sort of full stack, then maybe you had another one that was like a login or registration, or maybe you just had some other page, right? That we'll call maybe dashboard.html. And so what we currently were doing, or what you did in like Python and Java, or even if you had multiple pages within Web Fundamentals, is maybe you had a button or a link or something that connected these two HTML documents together, right? And so what you would do is maybe you logged in, and then once you logged in, it sent you to your dashboard.html, and it rendered this entire HTML file. Or maybe this was maybe like your user profile per se. And so here's your dashboard. And then all of a sudden you wanted to click on one user, and then you went to that other HTML file. And so what you're doing is you're going back and forth on all these different HTML files. And what you're doing there is every single time you're doing that, the DOM is rendered and you're rendering a brand new HTML file. And that can take up, depending on how many files you have and exactly what you need to do for that, it can take up a lot of time, right? And maybe you're loading the same things over and over and over and over again. Well, the way React works is instead of having multiple HTML files, it's what we call a single page application, or an SPA. So the way that you can think about it is, I'm going to do a single page application, SPA. And so instead of having multiple HTML files that you're redirecting and going back and forth, you actually just have one HTML file. So we're going to call this, and it's going to be called our index.html. So that's what it is. And what we're going to do is, instead of navigating to multiple HTMLs, we are actually going to, and if you guys ever were like me and you had Legos, right? And you wanted to like use a Lego for one thing, and you break it apart and you put it and use it to make another thing, sort of is the way that a single page application works. So if we're looking just at this project right here, so sorry, you're going to see this. we've got, I want to keep this page. So sorry that this kind of sucks right now, but we've got sort of this nav bar right here. We got this other nav bar on the left, and then we have our content, right? And depending on what page we're on, this content changes. If I go to convert arrow, that's what it looks like. If I go to debugging, this is all the same, right? Except this information changes. Well, that's how it works with a single page application. So let's say that we had our nav bar, right? So I want to draw. So we have this nav bar on top, got another nav bar on the side, and then we have our content here, right? Instead of having multiple pages and tons and hundreds, because we have hundreds of different pages for different curriculum, instead of having that, we can actually keep one HTML page and swap out what we call our components or our different pieces of this. So we just saw that the nav bars stayed the same, but maybe this middle piece is changed in and out. And if I click on one, it's this blue and or purple. Sorry, I'm partly colorblind, so I don't know what it is. It's that that box, or if we click on another thing, we want this pink box, right? We want this pink box that we can change in and out. And so what a single page application does is instead of having to re-render and go to a new page, it'll take this component and swap it out with this one. So this information stays the same on the left, and all we have to load is this component or this different piece, right? So let's say we had another one that we wanted to have, right? I can swap them in and out. So if I am on this page and I click on something over here, it takes this component, swaps it out with this one. If I wanted to navigate to another one or my original one, it takes this, sets it aside, removes it from what we call the DOM, and then it takes it back and puts it in here. So really you just have one HTML page that is just getting all the components switched in and out, just like Legos, right? If you have a whole bunch of Legos, you might use some of the base parts. And then there's other things. If you wanted your Lego to have a different color hat, right? The hats weren't really great, but you know what I mean? Like if you had a different color Legos and you wanted, oh, I want it to look like this. You don't take apart the entire thing and rebuild it. You just take one piece, you go and you change it, and you just apply that new piece of information or that new hat or color or whatever it is. So that's what a single page application works like under the hood. We're going to have one HTML file, and then all we're going to do is we're going to swap out what we call components. And so everything we have here on the left, all these nav bars, this is a component, this is a component, this is a component, and we can have multiple components that we can swap in and out. What's also really nice about this is, let's say we had, again, 100 pages. And let's say hypothetically, each page had its own nav bar that we added to it right here, nav bar 1, and had its own nav bar 2. And then it had this guy right here. Well, if I wanted to make a simple change, so instead of it saying home about, just home and about, I wanted it to say home about contact us. Well, if I had to do that one simple thing, I have to go to every HTML file, unless I've broken it down, but we haven't taught you guys necessarily that. I'd have to go to every file and change it, right? And if I forget one, then it doesn't have that newly updated code. The real power with React is, if I need to change this nav bar, I go to this component, and everywhere this component is called, that change is implemented, right? So it really decouples and takes away my code from having to go one to one to one to one to one throughout all these HTML files or these unordered lists or however you guys did your nav bar. And now I just have to change it in one, and wherever that nav bar is called, that new fix will be reflected. And so then it allows us to maintain code much, much easier. So that way we can continue to improve our code, to change our code, and then to make it look nice. And if we need to stand something up, if we have a new piece of content that we're creating, well, a lot of that work's already done for me, right? I've already created this nav bar 1 and this nav bar 2. I just already have this component too, right? This like different material. I just got to change what it says on this guy and create a new component, kind of make a copy of one and create it, and then we're good to go. So that's the real power behind this. And also, we're not reloading all of this new HTML. So single page applications are actually much faster, oftentimes can load much, much quicker, which gives our users a better user experience. React was made by Facebook. And so if you think about it, Facebook's constantly wanting you to upload and scroll and see new things continuously. So if you had a lot of loading time, or if you had a bunch of different pages and sometimes it took a long time to load, well, then you would see like, oh man, this is tough. You would want to get off of the platform, right? If it was loading, you might just click out of your phone app and then go do something else. And so unfortunately, they're probably like, hey, how do we keep them engaged quicker, right? How does it load quicker so we can continuously keep them engaged? So that way we can steal all their information and do whatever they do. So that is where components really come in handy. And that is why, I mean, that's a big driver of why Facebook created React in this way. So somebody said there must be some serious hocus pocus. Yeah, to an extent. Good old 90s MySpace stuff. There. Div. Yeah, so thanks, Stacy. It's very similar. Think of a div just being replaced by another, maybe. So it's not swapping HTML components per se. And that brings me to my next sort of thing. I'm gonna go ahead and, if you guys want, anybody want to screenshot this real fast? I'll give you 5 seconds, and if not, I'm gonna go on to the next. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.5, 1. Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and clear this. So the way that it works, let me get this. So the way that it works is when we have React, let me kind of get back. When we have React, it is JavaScript code, right? And the way that under the hood that it works is we're going to use this tool called JSX. And what that allows us to do is write HTML as JavaScript. So from the high level, we're going to write it like we would HTML, or it's called JavaScript XML. What React is going to do is it's going to take this code that is technically JavaScript, right? Because it's just some sort of function. And then we have some HTML code in there. It's going to use a tool called Babel. And it's going to convert that into JavaScript code for our DOM and our actual browser to manipulate and actually read and show on the screen. Now that is kind of geeking out on what you really need to know about it. But it uses this thing called Babel, and I think you can go to Babel.js. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow. That will convert the code that we're doing and the code that we're writing, even though it's JSX, it's not technically HTML. It'll convert it so that way when our browser reads it, it reads it as HTML and puts it where it needs to be. So it's not technically HTML, but instead of having to go to our DOM and render and do a get element by ID, we can use JSX and it'll do that for us. And that's a big, big thing with React, is it'll sort of out of the box do that for us. So it is amazing, 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 amazing. It's awesome. I love it. Great. So that from a high level is how a single page application works. And we're going to see that we're going to be able to use our Legos. We're going to use our sort of like, I guess a better thing would be, I don't know if you guys play Fortnite, where you can like change your skin. If you guys ever see, if you guys ever load in and sometimes it's like this one original skin, that's kind of the same thing. And then eventually it like changes your character to look like what it needs to be. Like especially if it's loading slow, it's kind of the same thing, right? Under the hood, it is doing one thing, and then it's just, or it's got sort of one basis, and then it's like changing the colors, but sort of the same thing. But we're going to see that we can take this code and we can change it to manipulate and do whatever we want to do. But if we need to change something, the beautiful thing is we just go to one component, we change it, and now throughout our entire application, it's changed. So React is dope. Okay. Hope that helped. Hope that was a decent overview of what a single page application is. I think you guys will get a better understanding of it. Now, what I want to do, we've got 1 minute, and this will only take maybe 2 or 3. So I just want to give you one warning. This is usually where students get a lot of issues. And so I just want to blatantly tell you right now, this is a big issue. So just be aware. When we are using create React app, or when we're creating a React project, right? If I use npx create React app, which is right here, this is doing a ton of stuff. Now, somebody asked yesterday, can we use Vite? Now, I looked into Vite today. Vite is dope. It's actually very cool, and I'm going to suggest that we do use it. It doesn't do some of the things that npx create React does, actually in a good way, because what I'm about to explain, Vite doesn't do. So it's very, very cool. But I would still encourage you guys to use npx create React app, because I'm not sure, again, if Vite, if there is something under the hood, I don't want us to get a little bit more advanced and all of a sudden it not work because it didn't get brought in. So I still would encourage that. But what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to, so if I cd back, I'm going to say MERN, cd to week 1, lecture 3, perfect, ls, cool. Oops, this is lecture 2, guys. What the heck? cd lecture 2, ls, perfect. So here is where I want to create my React app. So I'm going to go to my actual folder itself. And I am going to create my React application. Now, the way I'm going to do it, sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to run this npx. And obviously this is not a typo. So it is npx. And you need to have npm already. If you don't have that, please go back to the JavaScript side, download Node, follow that process because you can't do it without it. But we're going to use this starter kit called create React app. So I'm going to say npx create -react -app. And then I'm going to call this first app. Cool. Now, when I do this, it's going to take forever. It's going to download a whole bunch of things. If it is taking a long time, that is very normal. It's not like you broke it. It's just bringing in a ton of stuff. What this is doing is it's bringing in all of the packages, all of the things that we need, and it's going to store them in something we call our node modules. So if you guys have been trying to, zip up your files and upload it and it's too big, it's because you're going to have this. I now have this first app. I'm going to cd into it. If I type ls, you see that I have a whole bunch of stuff. So if I come back to my code, I have this first app that was just created. I've got all this stuff. We're going to go through this stuff tomorrow. So I can go through it more in depth on your package JSON, but you get this node modules and it is a huge folder, right? So if you guys are trying to zip up or put to GitHub and you have this, it might take forever. The way you do it is you navigate into the folder and you say rm space rf, rm space rf, and then you say node modules underscore, because that's what the folder looks like. And then if I run this, that is me removing the files, all files from node modules. So now if I come back, you see I don't have that folder anymore. Now, if you zip it up, it'll be much, much easier. It'll be much smaller. And anytime you're going to do something before GitHub, you want to make sure you sort of delete that, or you have a git ignore, which it automatically is created for you. So if you're putting it to GitHub, it'll automatically ignore that. We'll talk about git ignore tomorrow. Now, if I ever wanted to download them, again, I just put npm install or npmi if you're on Windows, and it will go look at this package JSON. This is all my dependencies. Again, we'll talk about this tomorrow because this isn't the one thing I wanted to hit on, but you see, I already have node modules back. So if you guys ever are wanting to zip it up, feel free to do that. If you want to go work on it again, just do npm install. One thing it's doing, and this is the biggest hindrance for students, is when you are creating this application, what it does is it creates a hidden file that is a Git file. You can do this by typing ls space -a. Mine's not going to show it, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But if you do that, you should see this .git file. or this Git file. These are some hidden files, right? That's what the -a is doing. Now, it will automatically do that when you run npx create React app. This is not my parent folder, right? So let's say I wanted to put my entire parent folder, like lecture 2, I wanted to put that on GitHub. Well, if you guys followed along, and this is why I do this in office hour, then we were going to go in and our first thing, what is the first thing we do if we wanted to create a new GitHub project within this? Anybody remember? Yeah, get a init. I would initialize a repository. You will get an error if you do not initialize a repository before you run npx create React app. The reason is because when you run create React app, if there is not a parent folder, i.e. your project folder, that does not already have an initialized Git repository, it will create one. If you do have a parent folder that already has an initialized repository, create React app will not create one. What do I mean by that? Well, lecture 2 lives within week 1, which lives within my April MERN. Now here, if I say -a, you see this Git file because I've already initialized this repository. So if you are going to have a folder where you're going to do all of your assignments, like I'm currently doing right now, and I will push to you guys, then you want to make sure you initialize that before you do anything with npx create React app, or else all you have to do is you have to go in and remove this folder. It's not that big of a deal. You remove it and then you run it and then you're fine. But if you are wanting to do each project as a new repository, my encouragement is just make sure you initialize before you run npx create React app, or else you're going to get into this nested Git repository and it's going to be a big pain. And especially if you're not familiar with the terminal, it's going to cause anxiety and you're like, oh no, I broke it. What am I going to do? It is an easy fix. If that does happen, we are all human. Gray, anybody, myself, anybody can help you with that. It's a very simple thing to do, a little process. But my encouragement is if you're going to do each project individually, which is super fine, it's totally up to you, however you want to do it. Just make sure before you do that, before you create a React app, you initialize your repository of your parent or whatever your repository is going to be.
And this is if we try to push it to GitHub, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. If you're going to push it to GitHub. Now, if you're not going to push it to GitHub, totally up to you. My encouragement though, friends, is definitely push it to GitHub, because what will happen is you guys, especially if this is your last stack, you're going to deal with a recruiter, and recruiters do not know what they're doing, right? They don't know anything about tech. I have a lot of friends who are recruiters. It's not a diss on them. They just don't know what they're doing. So they're going to come here and they're going to say, do you code a lot? Do you push a lot of stuff to GitHub? I didn't code on this account, but right. It'll say like, do you code a lot? But, and their idea, doesn't matter how much you know to code, is do you have a lot of green squares, right? So what I would do as an encouragement is I would start pushing everything. And it sounds silly, but they literally will look at green squares and be like, well, they're not really a developer because they don't push a lot of stuff to code or to the GitHub. It's so stupid. But I would encourage you guys, start getting, pushing things to GitHub, start pushing your code to GitHub. I'll do another walkthrough of GitHub by doing that, but make sure if you guys are pushing it to GitHub, again, I would encourage you to do that. Make sure you're first initializing your repository, then you're going and doing npx create React app. If you're using Vite, it doesn't create that hidden Git file for you, which is kind of nice. And that's why I'm like, hey, I think I really want to kind of suggest that and look more into Vite. So if you already have done that, it doesn't do that, but npx create React app does do that. So that is always a big hindrance. So please, please, please make sure you do that. Yeah. Push one HTML boilerplate. Just go in and say, just add a period to a sentence and then delete the period the next day and then add the period and then delete it. Just do that a couple of times and you're good to go. I'm serious. They literally don't know what is going on. They're just like, there's a lot of funny stories where people who literally wrote languages get turned down because they don't know a language enough. by the recruiter. They're like, we feel like you don't, after talking, I don't know that you know it enough. And they're like, dude, I literally created it. Like, what? I created the entire library. Are you serious? Fun fact. So
One side thing also, I noticed that you were downloading when you were installing the NPX, you were installing it. You said to not install it, to install it on the folder that you were going to work on. Now, this is the project folder, or can it be because I noticed that you didn't, because this is not installing it globally,
no,
right?
no, it's not installing it globally. It's installing it with this project, and we want to do it within the project. So here I'm in lecture 2. That's my parent project that has everything, as my main JS, my class overview, my React text that I just showed you. And then this is where I'm creating in. The whole point of that is because if you're creating a project, you're going to have this package JSON. And if I want to fork it, which means I want to take your code and I want to play with it, that package JSON, which again, we'll go into tomorrow, is basically like, cool. Hey, before you do this, here's all the requirements you need in order for this to run perfectly. Right. And so we're always going to create React app for every single project, because then we need those requirements. You can create we also will create our own package JSON in week 4. But for right now, you always want to do npx create React app. Cool. Any other questions? I'm so sorry. I went 10 minutes over. I hope that was helpful at least. Somebody asked, do all for loops have a start, stop, and a step? They do. Some of them can be implied though. I can do an office hour next week. Usually in week 2 is when I'll do an office hour of the different types of for loops. So I'm happy to walk through that. Somebody asked, is GitHub like a cloud code? So it's just it's a way that we can connect our repository. I talk about it in depth in our office hour, but you have a repository within your local machine. It's called our local repository. GitHub is a way that I can you can sort of think about it like a cloud, like I can connect the two. And then now if anybody wants to have access or take my code, they can do that. Cool. Any other questions? If not, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. I'll hang out here if you need anything. Other than that, I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we will see you tomorrow to really create our first components. Really excited. So stop the recording now.